So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start with what exactly is design research. And then we're going to talk about why you might want to do it. What's the value add of design research? Then how might you go about doing it? And finally, how would you integrate it within your practice as a whole? And the last 5 minutes or so, we'll have time for Q&A. So in order to give us some perspective of how we have arrived to where we have today, I'm going to go through a really brief history of design research. So it started in the 1960s, but a lot of the foundational concepts and thinking actually happened prior to that, such as operational research and some of the beginnings of Lean Six Sigma thinking, as well as some ideas around creative techniques. Then the first generation of design research came about in the 1960s, where we started to see some of the first conferences and several books for a lot of different industries coming out, trying to articulate what exactly does design research mean. And a lot of scholars look back on that time and call it a rational and systematic development of the field. So really just some of the initial sprouts of that thinking. So in the 1970s, we actually saw some of the early advocates for it starting to kind of talk against it because they felt that the methods had become too rigid. And ultimately, we needed flexible ways of doing things that they called wicked problems, which are essentially trying to reflect the nuances of human life and that there's a lot of complexity in some of the problems that we as people face. The 1980s then started to bring about the mix of rigid and flexible designs, and some of the terms like human-centered design started to sprout, as well as thinking around business management, trying to take a more design focus. So the 1990s was actually pretty monumental in that the formation of IDEO happened. So IDEO is the consulting firm that is often credited with the concept of design thinking, which is highly related to design research, and kind of started the popularization of it that then came about in the 2000s, kind of starting that third generation. This is where we started to see an emphasis on collaboration and on a diversity of input sources. So looking at things that are formal and things that are more informal. That took off big time. So in the 2010s, we actually started to see a commercialization of design thinking with a lot of schools offering classes, even degree programs in it, workplaces starting to borrow from the thinking of IDEO and selling it as services. That actually led to some people getting a bad taste in their mouth for design research because a lot of times it was focused around solutions and kind of lost a touch of the human-centered aspects that it was founded upon. So more recently, there's been a renewed advocacy for taking that human-centered perspective and trying to remain solution agnostic in going through the approach in order to foster creativity. So when we talk about design research, it is effectively design plus research. So design is the act of creating something through whatever medium it might be. It could be a space, a product, an experience, visual. So there's a wide range of formats that might take. Research is intended to be a systematic investigation that ultimately produces new knowledge. So when we combine the two, that's where we get design research. So design research is leveraging the design process itself as part of the systematic inquiry that needs to happen. And the ultimate goal is to better understand your stakeholders so that we can better design for them. And there are a lot of terms that come up in relation to it. I've already used a few of them. You'll see some things starting to pop up on the screen. And ultimately, what it comes down to is design research embodies human context, all of the nuances of it, all of the complexity. All right, so why would we do it? So ultimately, the reason why is it helps to create more impactful design solutions and give us confidence as designers in the ability of these solutions to actually lead to an impact. So just a few examples. It can help to enable a fit with stakeholders. It could improve performance. So this could be of operations, the design itself, or the way that humans behave in the space. Can help you differentiate from competitors and create something that is meaningfully unique. Can help you to reduce risk. This could be safety or business. Accommodate change and enable growth. So this could be a major shift directly associated with the project or planning for future changes 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And lastly, engaging customers and employees. So engagement has been shown to increase customer loyalty and staff retention. So how can we use design research to help with that? From a business perspective, we know that as you go through the different phases of a typical AEC process, the cost of your changes go up. Accompanying that is our design freedom goes down, of course, because there's a trade-off of cost and time in order to implement those changes as you go through the process. So with the traditional process, we may see more of a gradual ramp up of effort, of changes, and then kind of this last final push right before you move into construction to make sure you got everything that you need to in there so that you can go into construction, minimizing your chance of changes. But if we could push a lot of that effort to the front end of the process where we have more of that design freedom, using things like design research and collaboration, we can actually have a better impact on the lower end of the project and then gradually ramp down in a later stage. So we don't necessarily go away because things always come up. Value engineering happens. So we want to maintain that continuity of knowledge and input throughout the process. But if we can front load it, we have the best chance of affecting the exact design that we want to. Another good reason would be to align with some of the thought leaders in our industry. So I'll just list a few examples. So the AIA actually has a design for excellence framework where there are 10 principles where they try to create a more impactful design in order to challenge us as designers and practitioners to really push the envelope with what we're doing. Within LEED certification, you can actually use engagement and research as evidence for innovation credits. Well AP, in and of itself, is an evidence-based and collaborative process. And actually, if you read in the subparts of their documentation, there's actually several instances where they talk about the importance of using evidence, using engagement, including community engagement and consideration of human health throughout the entire process. And then specific to healthcare, we have the Center for Health Design. So this is a really wonderful resource if you've never come across it. They have a very thorough repository of resources, and they often do a lot of webinars pulling in experts from the field. They also lead what's called EDAC, so the Evidence-Based Design Accreditation and Certification. And although a lot of their resources are geared towards healthcare, there are some of them that can be very useful outside of healthcare as well, because they start to present some ways of thinking. And then one little bonus that you can get out of design research is a design element itself. So what you're seeing here is an example of how research has been applied into the design. This is a company called Cambridge Consultants, whose office is in Seaport. And they leverage design research, and I'll give two examples. So the blue dots that you're seeing with a little C in the middle are actually a data visualization of measurements from a project that the company performed. And that was used as wallpaper in the lobby that you see on the left. So behind everything that you see is that dotted pattern. The other example is the colorful string that you see. So this is a living interactive survey where each wooden peg is accompanied by a question and 3 potential answers. And staff members and visitors can then choose a string and wrap it around the pegs that correspond to their responses, and they can cut it down and refresh the survey over time. So it's kind of a cool snapshot of perspectives within the office. Okay, so hopefully I've now convinced you that you should do it. So let's talk about how we do it. Before we dive into specific methods, I just want to reiterate some of the foundational concepts. Design research is about being human-centered. We need to reflect a diversity of lived experiences from those who have experienced them. We need to embody empathy. So this is taking time to reflect on someone else's perspective, put yourself in their shoes, and respect that experience and that perspective, even if you don't fully understand it. Collaboration. So with all of this diversity of input and perspective, that ultimately leads to then working together towards a common goal. And how can you provide opportunities for all of these diverse perspectives to contribute, leveraging those different ideas and skill sets? We have divergent thinking. So this is giving ourselves the space to explore and identify alternatives rather than prematurely reaching conclusions or acting on assumptions. So really trying to get a breadth of ideas from all of those perspectives, giving everyone that opportunity to give some sort of input, and then converging later once you have explored multiple options. And finally, iteration. So this is integrating feedback loops and refinement opportunities to progress designs incrementally and check that our interpretation matches the intent. So these could be big loops, they could be small loops. It just depends on the timing within a project, and also whether we can demonstrate that we're on the right track versus if we need to course correct. So I'm going to introduce some methods. There are way too many to count out there. So I'm just going to introduce some that I see quite a bit. What you're seeing in front of you are two axes. The vertical axis has a spectrum from behavioral to attitudinal. So behavioral is what people do. Attitudinal is what people think and what they say. And those are three very different things. As we move towards attitudinal, we are typically more removed from the behavioral context. The horizontal axis goes from qualitative to quantitative. Qualitative is looking at characteristics, motivations, narratives, goals of people. Quantitative is looking at numerical measurements, patterns, and trends. So the first chunk in the bottom left quadrant is trying to look at how can we capture attitudes from a more qualitative perspective. So really trying to dig into what people think, what they believe, their perspectives, or their what's called a mental model, which is how they've constructed the idea of the way that something works in the world around them that influences then how they understand other things that they encounter. In the bottom right, we have surveys. So surveys are typically attitudinal, and they are typically quantitative in that they're trying to get a sense for the overall trend or overall pattern and a perspective. So that's where you lose a little bit of that why, that depth of nuance of motivation or some of the underlying reasons. The top left, so this is where we're starting to move more to that behavioral end of the spectrum. So we're trying to then capture more of that context of what people do. This is also typically where you start to lose conversation. So some of the things more towards the attitudinal side, there's a two-way communication with someone that you're interacting with versus towards the top. It's typically they're just acting within as realistic of a setting as possible while you are observing. And then the top right is trying to capture that behavior, but in a quantitative way. So in the left-hand quadrant, that's trying to get at all of the different ways in which someone might act within a space, versus in the top right quadrant is trying to find trends or specific patterns of movement over a large number of people. There's a handful that kind of sit on that vertical axis where they're not quite qualitative, they're not quite quantitative, they can be a mix of things. And similarly, things that hug the horizontal axis that are neither really behavioral or attitudinal. Again, it might be a mix, or it might be removed from context a little bit. So for example, simulation modeling is often used to identify potential operational processes and workflows and try to iterate it and improve on it. But the thing about simulation modeling, it uses simulated people who magically do exactly what they're told. So you lose a little bit of the nuance of that human behavior. What if someone does something different than what we expected? So that's why I would sit on that middle line. So when we talk about research, it's usually done for three purposes: exploratory, generative, and evaluative. So exploratory is when you're really you're kind of in this fuzzy state where you don't quite know what's going on. So you really need to go broad in order to get a sense of what's happening in the current state. Generative is looking at methods that can help you to produce specific ideas of ways that you can meet some of those needs that you found in the exploratory methods. And then finally, evaluative is looking at a specific design or a specific idea and trying to assess its fit with your stakeholders. So this could be from an opinion standpoint, but it could also be from a functionality standpoint. So one example would be an ergonomic analysis where you might be doing some level of measurement of how much force someone can provide or how quickly can they move in order to see if what you've designed for, let's say, a door that needs to open, to make sure that that's going to be conducive for the population who needs to use it. So I've introduced methods. So the next question is choosing the right method. And I'm not going to go through the details of everything that's going to pop up on the slide, but I want to highlight 5 key questions that you need to consider as part of choosing which method you're going to go with. So the first is, what is your goal? What are you trying to learn? The next is, what information or data do you want and how much of it? So what is going to be the right level of detail that you need to go into so that you can feed that into your design process and make an informed decision? Who do you want to learn about, with, or for? So those are kind of 3 different ways to kind of think about it. Depends on who your audience might be or who may be working with you in order to do the research. What effort and skills are required? So this could depend upon the complexity of the research or of the scale of the research that you're doing. And finally, how does it relate to the project plan? So how much would it cost? How much time do you have? And ultimately, what is your ability to influence design decisions? So when we talk about human engagement, inevitably that comes with all of the richness that makes us humans, including psychology. So there are a lot of potential biases and unintentional influences that can come into play that might impact some of the things that you would be interested in as part of doing an engagement. So I've listed 5 here. It may not be exhaustive, but choice, interpretation, behavior, communication, and focus are all very important when it comes to engagement. And you can see, like I said, I won't list everything, but you can see just the enormity of things that can influence the way that your engagement happens. So then how can we combat that? So I'm going to give some tips related to these 5 aspects. Again, not intended to be exhaustive, and I won't have the time to go through every single thing, but I will just highlight some of the most important practices. So within the choice aspect, it is important to give choice to stakeholders when you're engaging them. Ultimately, we as people want to have some feeling of autonomy and control. So it can be important to provide a handful of options, but not too many, because then we also reach decision paralysis point where there are too many choices to consider. The importance of presenting these is to understand the why behind choices that they make and discuss some of the trade-offs that might exist between your choices. You can also tease out what's preferred versus acceptable or unacceptable, so you can get a sense of what people can live with and what is nice to have. Interpretation. So this comes down to making sure that you've identified potential sources of a skewed interpretation. So as a researcher, you in and of yourself can be a source of skewed interpretation, and participants can as well. So it's important for researchers to try and approach a situation as objectively as possible. So that comes down to the specific way that we word things. So trying to use objective, balanced language, counterbalancing, which that's a practice of if you present multiple options to different people, you rotate what order they're presented in so that you aren't always presenting the first thing to all of the people, because that can actually influence their perception of things that are presented afterwards. And above all, it's important to pilot the study to make sure that you aren't, that you're catching things before you get to your time with participants. So behavior, this is all about making participants comfortable and able to behave as they normally would without having to think about it. So you can model a positive attitude and leverage environments and scenarios that are as realistic as possible. Communication. So ultimately, communication is improved when participants feel able to share openly. So some things you can do is repeatedly assure participants that there are no right or wrong answers. They're not going to hurt your feelings, that you hear and you acknowledge what they're saying. So this could be things like repeating back, asking for elaboration, thanking them for sharing, all doing it without providing any sort of judgment, whether it's good or bad. Finally, it's important to facilitate participants' ability to focus during your sessions. So help them become familiar with the thought processes or movements that they may have to do later in the session. That's kind of the key to a good warm-up activity. You can also borrow from improv techniques, such as using yes and. So this is all about building on ideas rather than stifling conversations and ultimately stifling an energy that someone might be bringing to the session. And finally, it's important to demonstrate ideas, especially if they're novel, rather than relying on a participant's ability to visualize or conceptualize it independently. So this is doing some sort of show or providing an analogy to help them understand what the new idea is. All right, so finally, how do we integrate with practice? So throughout a project, you need to ultimately make the space for design research. So each circle that you see in front of you represents the relative magnitude of the design research scope and at what relative frequency. So typically you start out a bit more broad in that fuzzy state where you're trying to make a sense of situations. Then you gradually bring clarity and narrow down your focus. In the middle of the process, you get more iterative as you develop aspects of the design and you check with stakeholders that you have appropriately captured their intent. Then as you reach into when it becomes more and more complete, so it's more representative of the final design as you progress to the right. During construction, there's less maybe direct involvement. It's more about monitoring what's going on and ensuring representation of the stakeholder voice as those trade-offs or value engineering happens. And then you prepare for occupancy, and then ultimately you deal with occupancy at the end. So now that people are in that full context of the design, how does our design deliver or not in that reality? And it's also important to make sure that you're feeding in learnings and information from your previous projects and then paying that forward to future projects. All right, so we're ready to build a team. Who do we want? So ultimately, a great design research team represents a variety of hard and soft skills. So again, I won't list everything and it's not intended to be exhaustive, but I'm going to point out some of the ones that I consider most important. So from a hard skills perspective, logistical planning is really key. Running any sort of stakeholder engagement or a study is effectively the same as running a big event. So you need someone who's capable of doing that. Also, familiarity with research methods and data analysis methods and any associated software that might need to go with that. So that could be Excel, that could be Miro, it could be something more specialized. And then data visualization techniques, as well as research ethics. On the soft skills side, it's important to be good at active listening, communication in different forms and with different people, having a problem-solving abilities. Since we're trying to remain solution agnostic, we want to be able to think from that problem side, and also a level of resilience. With stakeholder engagement, sometimes things just don't go the way that you planned, and you have to be able to roll with the punches and still be able to get the information that you need at the end of the engagement. So once you have a team, in terms of what you can do to help support your team is ultimately advocate for them and support them. So I've listed some things that, from my perspective as a design researcher, what do I value? So a resource library is really important to provide the materials necessary to do good work. Especially when you're talking about leveraging existing knowledge, there's often a cost implication to accessing information. So make sure we're setting teams up to actually be able to get that information. Also provisions for materials to run workshops and simulations such as Legos, even a mannequin, or even just a space to run a simulation. Continuous education. So just as we saw with the earlier timeline, perspectives and approaches evolve over time, and we can only expect those to continue to evolve. So it's important to provide ways that researchers can stay up to date on these perspectives and be part of early conversations that may not be documented yet. You, as an ally, can participate in lessons learned and give feedback to your research team in order to help them improve their practice. And then the most important thing that I want to leave everyone with is creating and fostering opportunities for design research. It's a still kind of growing, emerging field in terms of people's awareness and appreciation for it. So oftentimes it gets cut from programs when time and cost pressures come in. But if we remember that it can actually help realize cost and time savings in the long term, it can help to advocate for it. It can also be hard to demonstrate the impact and the difference that it can make until you live it. So provide opportunities to expose people to design research, get their foot in the door, and ultimately not make it optional. So you can reduce the scope as opposed to taking it out entirely. And finally, design research is all about staying solution agnostic, focusing on needs, problems to solve around that human context. So it's all about going through the process to enable identification of solutions. So the best we can do is trust the process. All right, thank you very much for your time. Please reach out if you want to connect. Here's my email and a QR code for LinkedIn.